more. And so please, if you can, put in your favorite Bible verse, your favorite chapter. Maybe you just have a favorite book. If you can do a Bible verse, but even just your favorite book in the Bible, when you put that in there, include what city you are coming from, and it will just be a precious way for us to get a feel of where people are at globally. Want to remind you that we have Q&A. My dad is going to speak for an hour, and then at 8 o'clock, we'll transition to questions, and we'll take your questions. He'll take your questions. So please ask your questions even right now. You can start submitting your questions. Questions on topic are the most likely to be asked. As you ask your questions, please make sure that's in the Q&A box, not the chat box. That way we won't miss it. If you're tuning in from YouTube, just put your questions in the comment section, and I'll be able to make sure those questions get asked. So yeah, please ask any of your questions. In a moment, I'll invite my dad up, but first, let's begin this evening with prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you that though we are all scattered around the world tuning in tonight, that you are everywhere we are. God, I thank you that you have spoken to your people throughout the centuries of time through your sacred word, the Bible. I pray that as my dad takes us through the Old Testament tonight, that you would speak through him to us. You know exactly what we're going through, and you're with us in it. And would you minister to us right in the places where we need you most? Would you bless my dad, bless him, and even minister to him as he ministers to us? In Jesus' name, amen. Well, without any further ado, please welcome Bible teacher Alan Gilman.
Okay, everyone. Hi. I'm there we go. Just trying to get everything going here. Sorry, a little difficulty here. There we go. That's what I was trying to do. Thank you, Daniel, so much. It's so good to have you back. I did feel a little lost last week without you. And even though we're in different cities, Daniel's in Toronto, as he said, and I'm in Ottawa, there's something really special about having him participate in the way that he is, hosting this for us, as well as vetting your questions and coming on at the end to do that. And so it's wonderful to have him here with me, even though we are far apart. I want to also thank those of you who have been writing me in between with whatever questions you have, whether it's a technical issue you're having, or you have a question that you didn't ask during the session, or you watched the YouTube video and you send it to me. And not only do I appreciate your questions, I really appreciated your positive comments that you've been sharing with me as this course so far has helped you. And I hope that's going to continue. This happened last week. I'm going to mention it again. And a couple of people have been raising their hand. And I might look into how to turn off that functionality because we're not having ongoing interaction through these sessions, but leaving answers to questions at the end. We're not doing the raising hand. If you have an issue, if there's something up, you could put that in the chat. If you can find where it is on many of your screens, it's at the bottom, and you can put something in the chat, and then it'll come up and I'll see it. So if there's something, if I'm being attacked from behind and I'm not aware of it and you want to let me know, put it in the chat, or any other kind of technical difficulty. I should say, I was talking to someone this past week and they made a comment on the quality of the audio. Normally, that's going to be due to something with the internet on the way to where you are, as opposed to what's happening here. I'm not saying that I don't have an audio difficulty here ever. It can happen, but there are so many factors that go in technically to making this all happen. And it's amazing how it all works. I'm so grateful that we have a tool like this. So again, if you have an issue on something up during the session, put it in the chat. Hopefully I'll be able to see it. And if you have a question, put that in the Q&A. If it's something that you'd like to see addressed during the session. All right. As you know, this is I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint presentation. This is session 4. And what we're going to be doing tonight is talking about the patriarchs. Those are the fathers of all that God has done in history. We're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob tonight. And we're doing so because what God does with them and their interactions with God and what has been recorded for us with regard to their lives is foundational to the understanding of the Old Testament and the entire Bible. So let's begin by looking at Abram, whose name was later changed to Abraham. So the beginning of his life, his name was Abram. Now, before we get into him and his story, I want to provide a little bit of background. I told you we're not going to be doing review because there's a lot to cover, and the YouTube videos are there for you if you need to catch up or refer to anything that I covered before. But it's important in order to fully appreciate the story of Abraham, we need to get some of this background. So first of all, we looked early on at the beginnings of the Bible, how the first human beings rebelled against God, and God's response to their rebellion, their disobedience, was to curse them, which was to bring about death and all of its effects, not only upon the human beings, but upon the creation itself. So the environment, the earth, the creation were all affected as a result of our first parents, Adam and Eve's, their sin. So everything was affected. Right from that point, however, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 13, God provides his first, what we now call a messianic promise, that someone would come who would destroy evil and the evil one, and being injured in the process. And that is a foreshadow to the coming of the Messiah, Yeshua, the Lord Jesus. But we don't have a lot of detail about how that's to happen, but we do have that first taste that the curse is not the end of the story. Then after Adam and Eve, things spiral down to the point of Noah and the flood, and God restarts or reboots or refreshes the creation. And then the next story is the story of Babel, which we looked at a little bit last time at the end of the session, where let's look at the beginning of their story. Last time we looked at the effect of what the people of Babel did, and it was the dispersion of the peoples on the face of the earth, and due to the confusion that God brought to the people's languages. But I want to look at why they were doing what they were doing, the thing that got them into trouble. And this is Genesis 11, verses 1 through 4. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." The purpose of the building of the city and the tower, it's not just the tower, it's the city and a tower, was not to create a tower so that in case there's another flood again, they'll be very high above the water. It does talk about its top reaching to the heavens, which is probably referring to the sky more than it is trying to reach God. That's not, they weren't trying to reach God. They weren't trying to protect themselves from another flood. But what they were trying to do is they were seeking to make a name for themselves, lest they be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And so what these people were doing is they were acting against God's express will, where God said that they were to spread over all the earth, and they wanted to make a name for themselves. They were looking for fame. They were looking for security. They were looking for protection in themselves and according to their own plans. And the outcome of that, and also, of course, they use resources and their intelligence, which in and of themselves, resources and human capability, there's nothing wrong with that. But their motive for what they were trying to do was It was self-focused and self-driven. And the result was disaster, and they were scattered. So against that backdrop in Genesis 11, we get to Genesis chapter 12 and the call of Abram. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So against the backdrop of Babel, where people were using their resources, their smarts, personnel, and all the rest, which ends in disaster, God calls an elderly, childless man to leave family and familiar and go to an alien, unfriendly destination that God would lead him to. And so we have this contrast between human self-drivenness, self-motivation, doing their own thing in their own way for their own purposes. And now we have a childless elderly man going to a strange place, completely vulnerable. And as many people know, if you've spent your whole life in a certain place, then you have to go and immigrate to a new place. Some people have a hard enough time changing neighborhoods, let alone changing regions of a country, let alone changing countries with language differences and climate differences and culture differences. And then to go alone without the kind of family structure that would give you protection that you need, and also the sense of actually being somebody, especially in those days. Abraham goes off into the unknown, and this is the beginning of the plan of God to rescue his creation from the curse. Before we get more into that, I just want to give you a bit of a literal picture here of the journey that Abram was called to. Before that, I just wanted to mention, so in Hebrew, Abram is Avram. And then Avram's name was changed to Avraham. And Avram is a very important name to me, not only is because of what a central figure Avram and Avraham is in the story of the Bible, but it's also because it's my name. So the name I was given when I was born was the Hebrew name Avram. I was named after my father's father. And in those days, the tradition was, especially among our particular Jewish culture, which is the Ashkenazi one, the Jewish people that are rooted in Eastern Europe, children were named after deceased relatives. And then in those days, in the English-speaking world, I can't speak for other places, other languages, they would take the first sound of the name and create an English name. And so that's how I got Alan. But my name is actually Avram, though I don't normally use it. And so anyway, back to this. So here's a current map of the Middle East. And Abraham started in the town of Ur, which is found in modern day Iraq. And then he headed up the river valley to Haran. And they actually stopped there. His father was alive at that time. They stopped there. It wasn't until his father died that they continued on their journey. And Haran is in modern day Turkey. And then he ended up, one of his first stops was Shechem in the land of Israel, which is currently Nablus in the West Bank. So let's continue. We were looking at this section, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. And I want to focus on God's promise to him. He says, I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you, make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And then he says, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So I want to look, first of all, at this very important biblical concept, blessing. So blessing, the word blessing is derived by the Hebrew word barach. Barach. I've written it, transliterated it into English using English letters. And one of the ways we represent the ch sound, like in Bach, is with an H with a dot underneath. That's one of the ways it's done. You'll often see it with represented by a CH. There is no, in the biblical languages, in Hebrew and Greek, there's no ch sound at all. So if you ever see in English a biblically related name that has a CH in it, we might pronounce it with a k in English, but it's never a ch, never no beginning ch, no ending ch, no middle ch. There's no ch's in Hebrew. So the word is barach, means to bless. And what blessing means in the scriptures, the concept of barach, it means to fill something with the potential for life. So when God blesses something, it produces life. So a tree that is blessed, a fruit tree, is a tree that produces fruit with seeds, that produces more trees with more fruit, with more seeds, or in other words, reproductive life, life that results in life. That's what blessing is. So when God blesses something, he fills it with the potential for life. And it's the opposite of arar. Arar. Arar means to curse, or in other words, to suck the life out of something. So if a land is cursed, like there are desert areas, and I'm not adding a moral thing to certain desert areas, I'm not making that kind of judgment, but just as an illustration, if you picture a very arid land, it can rain there from time to time, but the rain just gets soaked up and nothing grows. So that's the picture of something being cursed. As opposed to having the potential for life, the life is sucked out of it. And remember, God pronounced curse. He predicted the destruction of evil one day, and then he calls this man and says, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, this idea is picked up in the New Testament. Paul writes in Galatians 3, verse 8, and the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. And so Paul says that this promise to Abram, became Abraham, this promise given to him is the gospel. Now, I'm not going to get into the meaning of the gospel here. We'll talk about it more as we go along, but I think we will anyway. You can always ask me later. But this good news that we hear about in the New Testament is not simply that the Messiah has come and died for our sins so that we could be right with God and live forever with him. It's all important. Those are important aspects of the gospel. But what the essence of the gospel really is, the good news that is proclaimed through the Messiah and his followers, is the confrontation of the curse. It's the proclamation that the time of blessing has come, and that through the work of Messiah that had been anticipated for centuries, death is confronted, and sickness is confronted, and poverty is confronted, and ignorance is confronted, and inequality is confronted, and injustice is confronted, until the day that he returns to establish all that forever and for good. That is the essence of the gospel, and it's this expectation, it's this promise that was given to Abraham all these centuries ago, that through this man and his descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So let's continue on in Abram's story. We're going to look at what I'm calling the righteousness of Abram, and it has to do with what is it about this man that made him right with God. The word righteousness in scripture doesn't mean morally perfect. It means in right stead with God. And then it bears the fruit of right living. What was it that put Abram in right stead with God. Genesis 15, verses 1 through 6. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He'd already been in the land for a while. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. He was his chief servant. And Abram said, Behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. What put Abram still, in right stead with God is that he trusted him. When we talk about faith, maybe I mentioned this already. I'll probably say it again. I remind people this all the time. I have to remind myself. The word for faith or belief or trust in both Hebrew and Greek, all through the entire Bible, it's the same word. It's only in English that we separate belief from faith from trust. And that's why I prefer to use the word trust, because I think we get it better. Faith seems to be something that we think we can simply conceptualize about, hold it in our heads. But trust we understand better. Abraham trusted God at this point when God said to him, you don't have any children yet. And you don't have any children yet, but look at the number of descendants that you're going to have, more than you can count. And Abram hears this impossible promise and goes, yep. He accepted it. He accepted God at his word. The thing that Adam and Eve didn't do, Abraham is doing here. And this is what put him in right stead with God. There'd be a whole longer journey for him as he reckons with the fact that he and his wife cannot have a child and all the rest. And we're not going to get into all of those details, but it's just important to note that he didn't know everything yet. His trust, his faith had not been tested yet. We will look at that in a moment. But this was good enough for God to regard Abram as right with him because he trusted in God's word. A little further in this same chapter, I want to look at what I'm calling the covenant of the land. This is something that a lot of people miss, and even those that don't miss it may not fully grasp what God put into the guarantee that he gave to Abram or Abraham with regard to the promised land. So I'm reading here Genesis 15, 7 to 10. Before this, where are we here? Okay, so at some point he puts Abraham into a deep sleep. I might have this out of order here. No, it's after. I do have it out of order. So let's start over again. Let's just read this. Right, this is the next verse after the one I just read a second ago. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. And he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? So we're talking about the land now. He said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. He does that, and then he ends up in a deep sleep, and God speaks to him in his sleep and says that his descendants would be slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years, and then they would come back to the land. And then at some point, whether it's in the dream or not, it sounds like he's awake now, and it says, when the sun had gone down, this is Genesis 15, 17 to 21, when the sun had gone down, remember he has those pieces out on the ground, right? Behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring, I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And so God makes him this very solemn promise, calls it a covenant. We're going to be looking at the concept of covenant in a couple of weeks, pretty thoroughly. But for now, this is an agreement that God establishes with Abram. And the term made a covenant in Hebrew actually is cut a covenant. And it could be because things, rituals like this one were normally done, where animals would be cut up. And one of the reasons it seems why animals would be cut up as part of a ceremony to establish covenant with someone, whether it's another person or with God, was they were making a statement. The parties of the covenant, the two parties of the covenant, were making a statement to each other that said, if we break this covenant that we're making, may we be like these animals cut up lying on the ground. But then this interesting thing happens. Abraham is sitting there, lying there, and he sees a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passing through the pieces. And it seems what he's seeing is this is representative of God. What people would do as part of the covenants, they would walk through the divided pieces as a way of solemnly establishing the covenant. But Abraham doesn't walk through, and I know he's Abram still this time, so please forgive me. Abram doesn't walk through the pieces. It looks like only God does, signifying that if anything goes wrong with this covenant on whose ever part, of course, it would not be on God's part. So if something goes wrong with the other party, Abraham and his descendants, if they break this covenant, God would take the full responsibility of the broken covenant on himself. And this is why we would call this unconditional covenant, different from the Sinai covenant made through Moses later on, which we will look at. But God established, whether it was the promise of blessing to the nations or the promise of the land, God assumes all responsibility. And this hint that there are deadly consequences for breaking the covenant could be foretelling what the Messiah will do because of the broken covenant. So it is reasonable to say that when Jesus died for our sins, he also died for the sake of God's promise of the land to the Jewish people. Feel free to put any questions about that or comments in the Q&A or write to me later. Okay, so let's move on. So God makes another covenant with Abram. This is the occasion where his name changes from Abram to Abraham, or Avram to Avraham. It's the covenant of circumcision. Genesis 17, 9 through 14. Let's be a couple of slides here. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring, both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So circumcision is mentioned 24 times in the New Testament. It's a very important concept. It's quite striking that Abram, becoming Abraham, circumcises himself when he's 99 years old. And that must have been really, really something. And people wonder, why circumcision? And I'm not going to get into graphic detail here, but there's something very interesting about spirituality, in the Bible, biblical religion. And in contrast to the customs and religions of the surrounding peoples in that day. Those religions were full of sexual promiscuity, sexual acts to whether fertility rites and this sort of thing that were ways to relate to the gods. This kind of activity is completely not found in biblical spirituality. And what seems to be going on by telling Abram that he is to be circumcised in the foreskin, the flesh of his foreskin, and that all the males should be done that, it seems to be God saying that part of your life is mine, and you have no right to do with it whatever you want. Talk about counterculture to today, but also for most of the history of the world. God, I mentioned was it last week, 2 weeks ago? Last week, how God invented sex. And we're going to talk about more about the goodness of sexuality later in the course. But it's an important part of life. It's to be respected. It's to be honored. It's not to be looked down upon. It's not dirty, but it's to be controlled. And it's to be used in the service of God, in the fulfillment of his plans and purposes on earth, and not simply for our pleasure and doing whatever we want with it. Well, it actually goes further than this, because there's also a sense in which this circumcision is a symbol of something way deeper and more painful. This is later on, Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 to 16. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples as you are this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart. Ouch! And be no longer stubborn. This was a culture that understood circumcision. And God was using a very vivid image to talk about a deeper kind of circumcision, not of the flesh, but of our very personhood, that we need to remove the outer, figuratively, the outer exterior covering our hard hearts and be open to God. And so it's not unusual that in the midst of discussion in the New Testament, Paul writes, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. This term Jew comes from the tribe of Judah, and it resulted in becoming applied to the whole people of Israel. And so Israelite and Jew become synonymous by this time. And the word Judah, the name Judah is derived from the word for praise. And so Paul is doing a bit of play on words here, that the being a real Jew is someone who has done what Moses said. A lot of people think that these internal heart teachings are New Testament as opposed to Old Testament, but they're not. Paul is expounding upon a truth that has always been true, that the exterior elements of our faith, our trust in God, are supposed to be representative of inner realities. And so, some people use this verse, Romans 2:29, to say there's such a thing. They actually talk about spiritual Semites, that in the New Testament, that when you trust in the Jewish Messiah, then all people become spiritual Jews. That's not what the New Testament teaches. The New Testament talks about non-Jewish people being grafted into this olive tree. I'm not going to get into that more here. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is this understanding that the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Jewish people, were always called to be a people who lived a truly authentic spiritual life that was something that was real inside, that was expressed in their lives. That's always been true. Then we come to one of the most disturbing, actually. If you're not disturbed by this story, maybe you haven't thought about it that much. A lot of times what we do is we jump to the end of Bible stories and we don't walk them through seeking to experience them as the people did, like Abraham and his son Isaac did. So this is much later. Isaac is the miracle child is born. We don't have time to get into all that now, but Isaac is the son of the promise, and then God tests Abraham. And the way we refer to this story in Jewish tradition is it's called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. So we're reading Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains on which I shall tell you. So this is actually a terrible story, that a man should be told by the God that he trusts to kill his own son. It's also terrible as the reader to watch Abraham being willing to do this. And we're so quick to go, well, God told him to, and Abraham was faithful to God. And so of course he did it. But that's not how this is experienced in real life. And when you read the whole story, many people point out how the narrative, the way the story is told, is really slowed down. There's this very ominous feeling to it. And there is a comment in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament that says that Abraham believed that God would even raise Isaac from the dead. He knew that God must have had something up his sleeve, but he didn't know what. And so, another thing too, thinking of the story from Isaac's perspective, when they finally get to Mount Moriah and he's put by his dad on this wood, and his dad goes to plunge a knife into his heart. Like, this is horrible. And the fact is, God leads his people on some very disturbing paths. It's not tra-la-la with rose petals and daisies. Following God it can be frightening and dangerous and troubling, as it was for Abraham and Isaac that day. So let's go on in the story. This is now, he's about to do it. Genesis 22, 10 to 14. A couple of slides here. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And so I'm just trying to see, do we go on here? Yeah, let's read this. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now you might think, well, didn't God already say this to him? Well, this is a confirmation of the promise. And God speaks to Abraham over and over again. And that's what God does. And he does that as we go through life with him. But it's also important to see that this confirmation comes on as a result of seeing the fruition of the reality of God that was already in Abraham. And that's what tests are really all about. When you go for a medical test, they do things to you, sometimes rather unpleasant, to see what's really going on in there. And you may not have thought of this before, but when you take a test for school or for something else, a practical test or written test, it's designed not so that you could achieve the doing of the exam. That's what it feels like. Oh, I really need to pass this exam so I can get a certain kind of credential. So it feels like doing an exam is an achievement, but really what an exam is, which is a fancy word for test, is testing what's really there. Do you know your stuff? And so when God tests Abraham, he's testing him in a sense to see what's really there. But you might say, but doesn't God already know what's there? But there's a sense in which God desires to see what's really there in the reality of the experience of life. And then, we could philosophize, and are these tests really for God, or are they for us? And it's, I think the answer is yes. And I don't really know for sure, but tests are important to find that reality that's really going on us. And when we fail tests, it's actually for our good, so that we could stop pretending that we're something that we're not, so that we could become what we should be. And so we shouldn't get discouraged when we fail tests. And then there's another opportunity to show that there is this reality really working in our lives. And so when we're struggling in something that we think is a test from God, let's seek him and look to him to make his reality our reality in us. One more thing before we go on to looking at Jacob is it is really something that, while what Abraham and Isaac had to do that day was quite traumatic and difficult, they were actually touching the act of God himself in his giving of his own son. And we talked in the first week, I think it was, about these things called types, and the way here Isaac is replaced by a ram that was caught by his horns in this thorn bush, a thicket, and how later on a father would give his son. This time he would not be replaced by another sacrifice. He was the sacrifice, but the Roman soldiers made a crown of thorns like that bush and put it on the head of the Messiah. And so the whole experience of Abraham and Isaac foreshadows and reflects, depending which way you're going, the very act of God. And you may or may not know that location, Moriah, is likely where the temple was built later on in Jerusalem, and very close to where Jesus would be crucified. Any questions you have about what I've talked about so far, remember, put them in the Q&A or in the comment box on YouTube, or you can write to me directly. I know I keep saying this over and over again, but please don't be shy. Please go ahead and put in your questions. So now for the rest of our time, the time remaining, we're going to be looking at Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. His name is later changed to Israel. We'll look at that. He was one of two sons of Isaac. So I'm going to briefly mention some highlights of his life and then focus on a couple of them. So in Genesis 25, we have the story of his birth. He was the younger of two twins. The older brother was Esau. They were clearly, I think the term is fraternal twins, because they looked very different from each other. And right from birth, Jacob was seeking to get his way, seeking to get ahead. And that's symbolized through the grabbing of his twin brother's heel from birth, and that Jacob is derived, the name Jacob is derived from that kind of activity. And that approach would mark him for the rest of his life. And we see, first of all, the promise given is that the younger Jacob, or the older would serve the younger, that the normal honor given to the eldest son would be passed on to Jacob. And we don't know the relationship of that promise that his mother, Rebecca, knew. We don't know how much of that Jacob himself knew, but it did seem to be a contributing factor into their behavior. So later on, when they're grown up, there's the story of Jacob buying Esau's birthright from him. And that happens in Genesis chapter 25, where Jacob is at home. He's the homebody. He's this person that we would call a mama's boy. And on the other end, while Esau was more of his dad's son. He was a hunter and a man of the field and this sort of thing. And Jacob came in totally famished, and he saw Jacob making some lentil stew, and he thought he was dying, which I don't know if he really was, but you know what it's like, and especially when we were kids. I'm starving. And I kind of picture Esau had this gruffly voice, and he says to Jacob, give me some of that stew, boy. He had a bit of a Texas accent, and Jacob says to him, sell me your birthright. Jacob looking for that opportunity to get what didn't seem to be rightfully his. He wanted the birthright, some sort of honor that would be that seems to be that first place. Give me first place in the family, that sort of idea. And we're told that Esau sells his birthright for this bowl of stew, and that he despised his birthright, which means he cared less about it. He saw no value in it, while Jacob had his eyes fixed on getting the first place in the family. So the next thing in this highlight reel, in chapter 27 of Genesis, is the stealing of the blessing. And so some people might think, well, if you have the birthright, then you get the blessing. But there's some elements to this that we don't really know exactly about how all this works. And in some ways, it doesn't really matter because of what God's going to be doing later on. But for now, what we see here is Isaac seems to be dying. He actually lives a lot longer, but his eyesight is failing. They think he's going to die soon. And Rebecca comes up with this idea because it seems she knows this prophecy from the time before they were born. She comes up with this scheme that Jacob accepts, that he's going to get dressed up like Esau. Well, actually, it was all set up that, So Isaac wanted Esau to go and catch him some game to make some meat stew for him to enjoy before he died, even though he was going to live a lot longer. But it's a good chance he thought his days were really numbered. Rebecca had overheard this and came up with this plan. And the plan was that she would make the stew perfectly like her husband would enjoy it, and dress Jacob up as Esau, and he would go in and trick his blind dad into thinking that he was Esau so that he could get the primary blessing. And so they pull it off. And you can read that for yourself. I think it's a humorous story. Isaac the dad, kind of knows that something's up, but he tricks him anyway and gives them this wonderful blessing and basically passes down to Jacob, not Esau, the promise originally given to his dad, Abraham. And now he blesses Jacob with it. Esau comes in, sees what happened, gets a different blessing. We don't know why Isaac could have made any changes, but this is how the story goes. And it infuriates Esau, and he wants to kill Jacob. Rebecca, hearing of this, decides to come up with a reason to send Jacob back to where she's from, which is the area called Padan Aram, also Haran, where Abraham had spent some time with his family before coming to the land of promise, the land of Canaan, which would become the land of Israel. He goes out there, Mesopotamia, and to find a wife there. And so I'll continue on with that. No, I'm doing this next. So on the way, he's now on his way to find a wife among his mom's family. And on the way, he has a dream. And from the dream, then he makes a vow or a promise. So let's look at that. Jacob's dream and vow. And he, that is Jacob, dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and on top of it, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, to the north, and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I'm with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I've done what I have promised. Before I go on, I just want to mention God himself passes the promises given to Abraham and Isaac to Jacob. Now, did Jacob have to steal? Did he have to buy the birthright and steal the blessing for this to happen? We'll never know, because we only know what did happen. And so God gives them these promises. Then we go on. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." Let's skip down a couple of verses. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I will come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I've set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you." So I don't know how obvious this is. I knew it took me a while to notice it, but Jacob says, if God is true to his promises, and that he promising me that he'll take care of me in my journey and brings me back safely to this place, then he will be my God, which tells us that the God of his father and grandfather was not yet his God. So do notice, he was raised in this family with true God stories. God himself appears to him and gives him these promises, and he's relating to them, but he's aware that God himself was there and appeared to him, but he wasn't yet willing to commit himself personally to the Lord. Not yet. So take note how much God experience a person can have and yet still not really believe or trust in him. And so the next thing is Jacob basically goes into exile. He lives in Padan Aram, Haran, Mesopotamia, for about 20 years or so. And I won't get into the whole story. You can read it yourself about the wife that he wanted and the wife that he got, and then he got the wife that he really wanted, and then the difficulty with having kids and the maid servants. And so there are actually 4 women, and he ends up with 12 sons and daughters and some daughters. That's the summary. And eventually it's time for him to go back. And so he begins the journey back to the land of his birth, and he has a crisis. And what happens is he gets word that his brother Esau is on his way with 400 men. And so he thinks, reasonably so, that Esau was waiting all this time to get him. And so let's see what happens. Jacob prays. Genesis 9, verses 9 through 12. And Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac." See, it's still there. He doesn't say, "Oh my God." He's praying to the God of his father and grandfather. "O Lord, who said to me," acknowledging that God spoke to him. See, I'm not making this stuff up. "Return to your country and say to your kindred that I may do good. I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I've crossed this Jordan. Now I have become 2 camps." He's even thankful to this God who's not his God. And he prays for help. "Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." So he knows he has these promises. He hasn't really committed himself to God. He thinks he's in great big trouble. And that's why he prays this prayer. And then something extraordinary happens. Jacob wrestles with God, continuing in chapter 32 of Genesis. Let's read it here. And we're getting near to the end of this session. "And Jacob was left alone." What had happened was he came up, like Jacob always has plans. Read a story, always has plans, always wheeling and dealing. And what he does is he sends animals and people in front as a buffer between him and his own kids and his wives, and then there's a river, and then there's him. He creates all this buffer. He wants to appease Jacob, hopefully, as Esau rather. He wants to appease Esau with this lavish gift that maybe this would soften his heart. But he's still freaked out, afraid that it's not going to work. And in the midst of that, in the night, this happens. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, Jacob, let me go. Oh, no, sorry. The mysterious person says, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. There's Jacob again. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, the mysterious person, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Yisrael. It was Yaakov, now Yisrael, Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God. Peniel means face of God, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, different spelling, limping because of his hip. And so Jacob has this wonderfully devastating experience with this mysterious man who is actually God. But we need to notice what God actually says to him. I underlined it here. You have, your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. Why? For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. The reasonable response to this statement is, what? You've striven with God and with men and have prevailed? Striven with God and have prevailed? God says this to Jacob? Hopefully I didn't blow your ears out. Please forgive me if I did. I think I have auto level on working on here. Anyway, I'll hear about this after. You've striven with God and have prevailed? Well, first of all, how does that even work with the story? But it's such a wild story. So we know the man is actually God. And Jacob's holding on to him and he won't let go. And he puts in this request. Pardon me, sir, who I'm wrestling with, let me go. And no, I won't let you go until he bless me. And God touches the hip socket, boop, do a little boop, and dislocates it just like that. And yet Jacob won't let go. He hurts him. He cripples him. Not permanently crippled. He's able to walk, right? But with a limp. And we don't know if he limped for the rest of his life or just limped for a little while, but God injures him. And yet says, you've prevailed over me. And this is a theme statement about the people of God, the people of Israel in the Old Testament, striving with God, striving with God. We're going to see Moses. God tells there's a thing happens with the people of Israel. God wants to destroy the people. What does Moses say? No, don't do it. Read David's prayers. What are you doing, God? Or Job? We don't really know when Job happened, but it's the same sort of idea. Job holds on to God for dear life and doesn't give up until God comes through for him. And yet we have this image of faith and what faith is supposed to be and what we think trusting God is supposed to be. It's kind of this serene, oh, I love God, I trust him, and I'm good. We confuse this ancient philosophy of Stoicism, that's that stiff upper lip, which, moral fiber and doing the right thing even when it hurts. And yeah, we need to do the right thing even when it hurts, but the true person of God is a person who wrestles with God and holds on to God, even if it kills him, till God comes through. And so God invites us into this grappling with him, this wrestling match, so to speak. Now, I do advise people, don't box with God. Don't. No, boxing matches with God, bad idea. But wrestling, yeah, hold on to him until. And then we see what happens, what this does for Jacob. Genesis 33, verses 18 through 20, and then we're done. And then we'll look at questions. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem. That's where Abraham started off when he arrived there, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram. And he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Yisrael, which means God, the God of Israel. One of the results of that wrestling match is now, not only is Jacob changed, but God is his God. And here's the difference between experiencing God, which he already had. He had knowledge of God, experience of God, but now he knows God, and God is his God. That's really worth thinking about for a long time. Before I go to questions, next week, we will begin to look at the rest of the books of Moses, and we'll be doing that for several weeks and get to some of the core of Old Testament teaching and learn how we are supposed to relate to what God reveals in this foundational part of his word. So I will stopping the screen share, invite Daniel to come back.
Yeah, I'm back.
All right. Let's see here. I think I can do this and do that. And I think we're both here on screen for everyone, and take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dad, so much for your time and insights. There are several questions centered around Jacob, so we'll jump right into them.
So Daniel, on my end, you're a little breaky up. Maybe if you spoke a little louder, it could help. I'm not sure what other people are hearing, of course.
This is probably correct. I'm trying to switch from these headphone speakers to my computer speakers, which seem to be better. The mic. Check 1, 2. Is this any better?
The mic is sounding raspy.
That is a heartbreaking thing. We're just going to try our best.
Yeah. So if you don't speak too quickly, as I tend to do, that'll also help.
Okay. Thanks, Dad. Ruth from Prince Edward Island says, I heard the word wrestle. It's not physically wrestling. It was wrestling as in arguing, debating, like when we wrestle with the decision, what do you say?
I'm thinking, okay, just wanted to make sure. So Ruth says, I heard that the word wrestle is not physically wrestling. I've never heard that. Certainly we use the term metaphorically like that, wrestling over, we could wrestle with ourselves, wrestling over a decision, that sort of thing. From the description, it would be a little funny for them to be having this, an argument, and then in the middle of the argument, God in the form of a man touches his hip and dislocates it. It's possible, I guess, but I don't have any reason to think that this was not physical wrestling.
Okay. Thanks, Dad. Lucy from Lions Head, Ontario says, I always have trouble with this story, including a few others, as God appears to bless people who seem deceptive and ungodlike. What am I missing?
I'm really glad you asked that, Lucy. Not that I'm not glad for the other questions, but there's something about this that I think really does need to be addressed. And the fact is, first of all, we're all messed up. So maybe on the outside, some people seem to be trustworthy and honest. And certainly on the outside, there are people that are more honest than others. And even on the inside, there are people that are, more this than that sort of thing. But we are all in the same boat. So on one hand, we need to be careful not to think in terms of there's a good guy, there's a bad guy sort of idea, especially when it comes to having genuine encounters with God. Second, God will, in a sense, God blesses everybody. We get that statement by Yeshua in the Gospels about how we should love others, love our enemies. I think I have the right section. I may be mixing them up, but because God sends the sun on the rain on all people. And there's a sense in which everybody has a level of blessing from God. Well, then you get to, well, some people are blessed more than others, but some of that, it's our judgment, what we think of as blessing and not. But let's bring it to this story. In some ways, Esau appears to be the victim, and Jacob seems to be the crook. Well, while Jacob's uh, his tactics are not that noble, Esau really does show his true colors. Jacob may not know exactly what the blessings of his dad and his granddad are all about, but he wants them. He has his life geared towards the blessings of God, even though he doesn't really understand what they are, and he doesn't really know how to go about getting to them, achieving them, so to speak. Esau, on the other hand, couldn't care less. This idea, there's nothing wrong about being a hunter, a man of the field sort of thing. There's nothing immoral about that. But it's clear that his heart was turned away from God and the things of God. Jacob's heart was turned towards things of God, even though he was really twisted as we all are. And then in the midst of his journey towards the things of God, including the fact that he got himself into trouble and was running for his life, in the midst of all that, God was actually pursuing him. And there were elements of how Jacob went about things that actually suited what God really wanted. There's a sense that God looks for, wants people to be, there's a word, I just lost it. Maybe Daniel will remember it. But like having this audacity to almost like storm the gates of heaven until getting satisfaction. Jesus tells a parable of a woman praying, insisting with this judge until she gets justice, and he uses that as a way to talk about prayer and then how we need to be earnest in prayer. And what we tend to do is, in the name of faith, we are nice. And we're nice unto God. Well, God doesn't really want that. And look at the other people in the Bible. They're not nice unto him. They wrestle with him and discover his blessing. Hope that makes sense. Hope that helps.
Well, Andrew from Prince Edward Island asks a great follow-up question, which is, you tell us to wrestle with God, and at the same time, we are told to rest in God, Psalm 46:10. How do we reconcile these two approaches to our relationship with God?
Well, aren't we supposed to work and rest in the same body in the same day? Life is complex. So I remember years ago, I did a sermon based on a passage in the book of Hebrews that talks about running the race. So the talk was on running the race. And somebody came up to me after and said, I thought we were supposed to walk with God. And I thought, I had more hair back then. And like, what's the problem? And I'm sorry if I'm sounding, I could feel like I don't mean to be put downish, but some of these things should be obvious, that that life is complex, relationship is complex, and they're multifaceted. And so, yes, we're to rest in God. And it's very interesting, in back to the book of Hebrews, it talks about striving to enter our rest. Now, there's a paradox there, but it's like we have to fight to find that peace in God, because naturally we don't. And when we have moments of that utter serenity, life gets in the way, and even God's will get in the way and drive us to a place of where we begin to struggle again. And there's a sense in which that eventually, as we mature in our walk with the Lord, the striving that we do is actually rooted deep, deep, deep in God, and not out of a place of utter of despair and helplessness, and where we're so full of anxiety that to the point of complete distraction and, as I said, despair. And so because that the story of Moses I mentioned earlier. It's because Moses knew God in a way that almost nobody ever has. He was so secure in his relationship to God that when God said he was going to do such and such, Moses was able to say no to God himself.
Yeah. Dad, can I say something?
Yeah.
I I I don't know much about wrestling, but I imagine just from other sports that if one lets himself get panicky or even angry at their opponent, they're not going to wrestle as well. That an excellent wrestler is probably going to have a certain sense of calm and like rest and confidence as they go about wrestling, and they're going to be way more successful. And I couple that with a thought that as you were speaking, and I just think of C.S. Lewis has a quote that's something like, "A friend is someone who sings the song of your heart when you've forgotten it." When you mentioned Moses, I think the same thing with the prophets. The prophets in the Psalms, they sometimes, especially in the Psalms, will be like Moses, like wrestling with God, like, God, this is what's happening, but God, you are like, you're better than this in a sense. Like, would you, they're singing the song of God's own heart back to him. So they're wrestling with him, but grounded in the confidence of the character of God. So there's rest.
Yeah, that's really good. Maybe I didn't say that because I haven't gotten there yet, and my wrestling with God has a lot more anxiety to it. But talk about striving. I think that's somewhere we need to get to, where we wrestle with God. Which one of the things too that I don't think we spend enough time with. How, what some of the ways we wrestle with God is as we wrestle with life, in life circumstances. And I don't mean to say that God is some way to talk about the circumstances of life. No, God is real. He's a real personality. He's a real being. But the way he works in life is through many of our circumstances. And I agree with you that we need to come to a place of confident wrestling.
Thanks, Dad. Here's a interesting. They're all
when you sound tons better, by the way.
Oh, good. Yeah, my AirPods don't work very well. Okay, let's go with Kay's question. It's a bit of a preamble, but it's really interesting. I'm curious to know what you'll say, Dad. My opinion is Esau had low blood sugar. He smelled and saw food and didn't care how he acquired it. I have the same issue. When my sugar goes down too low, I'm not able to make clear, concise, and wise decisions. Could Jacob have taken advantage of Esau's lack of clear head? I realize it's stated somewhere in the Bible that Esau didn't value his birthright, which is the underlying factor. But would a rash decision made under the influence of low blood sugar cost him so much?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, and very, very relevant, and it relates to how responsible are we as we act out weaknesses that we can hardly help. And it really comes down to, my understanding of scripture is that we are completely responsible for those things. And while on one hand, God takes us from where we're at, we're not left off the hook for bad behavior because of how we might be feeling due to a condition. I could speak for myself. As you know, Daniel's one of 10 kids, and he could testify too. I know what it's, you come home, long day of work, and take it out on the family. There's no excuse for that. How many working people, though, understand the effects of pressure, of the kind of pressure, or maybe something particular happened. I'm not ready to talk about it yet, and how that could affect my mood, my words, my behavior. Thing is, kind of like what I mentioned earlier, we all come into life without a full deck. We're all missing things. We're missing things intellectually. We're missing things physically. We're missing things emotionally. We all struggle with things, and that's all due to sin and the curse. And God has unveiled the story to us so that we could find help for all those things. And the way we find help isn't that we're going to, prior to the return of the Messiah, that we're going to find relief for all the things that we are stricken with. We're still going to, we're all crippled to some extent. And the sooner that we learn that we all need a crutch, leaning on the Lord for his help in every way, including his forgiveness for when we mess up, which is talk about something that's mind-blowing, that there's nothing that we might do that except for completely rejecting God's offer of salvation in the Messiah. Apart from that, there's no weakness, nothing we're stricken with that can ultimately get in the way of our accessing God's acceptance, that righteousness that Abram found by trusting in God. Our lives still we might find ourselves out of sorts in all sorts of ways, even though we know the Lord. And I think what the person asked is what they said in their question is very helpful. Certainly Esau might have had issues, but it's very clear he could care less about the birthright. If he would have valued that which was truly valuable before God, then it would be a completely different story.
Thanks, Dad. Sue asks a question, not about Jacob for a moment. Will you be presenting the Old Testament in order of the books or as written, or will you help us understand it chronologically?
We're going to be doing it for the most part in book order. I did tell the story of the Old Testament in the first class. I could share with you, I'm trying to think, or did I already? I might have shared the handout of the storyline of the Old Testament. I think I did. We're going to look at the storyline of the rest of the books of Moses next time. Personally, I'm not that concerned about the chronology because the books were not, the writings themselves were not given to us necessarily in a chronological order. And when we seek to do Bible chronologically, and I know you could buy Bibles that are chronological Bibles, and they'll actually break up the books and try to put them in a chronological order as best as possible. This is scholars guessing at what the chronology might be. And so I personally would rather not do that. When we're looking at individual passages or individual Bible books to see where certain things might fit in the overall story, I think that's helpful. But I would rather do the Old Testament in the book order.
Okay, thanks, Dad. You may have already said this, but I know at least on week 1 or 2, you mentioned about how the English Bible and the Hebrew Bible are in different orders. When you say you're going to go through book order, is it the Hebrew or the English?
Modified Hebrew order.
Modified Hebrew. That's
yes. So we'll be going through the books of Moses, and then we're going to go to the prophets. Is that right? I think we go to the. No, sorry. So we are going to do I don't have those notes in front of me. Do the books of Moses, and then continue the historical, what normally in the English, what we call the historical books, which gets confusing. In the Hebrew order, those are called the former prophets. So the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, those are called the former prophets. And so we're going to go through all those. And then when we get to the end of 2nd Kings, then we do the writing prophets, starting with Isaiah. And then we're going to be looking at the writings like the books of Psalms, Proverbs, and so on.
Okay, well, thanks, Dad. The best way to find out the order is for everyone to just keep coming back. The next question is not about Jacob, though there are more questions on Jacob coming in. But this is from Jan, and Jan asks about Abraham. Genesis 12, verse 3 is sometimes translated, "I will curse anyone who dishonors you." Can you clarify why it is usually translated, "I will curse anyone who curses you"? So if it's
I would have to look it up in the Hebrew, and I could get back to everybody on that, and I could try to guess, but I'll not guess. And I could look it up sort of quickly, but it'll still take too long. So let me check that one out.
Well, Dad, thanks for doing the heavy lifting and the homework for all of us. Here's another question about Jacob and Esau. I was wondering, asked Tara from Scarborough, I was wondering what the difference between a blessing and a birthright is. This is in reference to the story of Jacob stealing Esau's blessing. Why couldn't Isaac revoke his blessing of Jacob? Why was his blessing of Jacob binding? I feel like I'm missing something. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're all missing something because I don't think we have all the details to fully understand that, but those are all good. They're good questions based on good observations. There is that thing where when Esau comes in, realizing that he'd been ripped off by his brother, don't you have a blessing for me? And instead of going that Jacob's blessing is null and void because it was gotten illegitimately, and simply giving it to Esau, why didn't he just do that? Well, he didn't do that. And is that the way God works? If somebody speaks a blessing, it's automatically binding. And even if it's done illegitimately, as if there's this power in the words themselves and they can't be revoked, it sounds like that. Is that the objective truth? Don't know. And there's no comment given to us. All we know is what happens. What helps me is it seems that God intended to do this for Jacob, and then we see the unfolding of the circumstances. And I don't think there's a one-to-one relationship between God's ultimate will in something and all the various circumstances that happen in the way, as if Jacob had to do this and had to do that, and then Esau didn't do it, and all as if they were puppets. There's no sense that there's God is overseeing the situation. He has his intentions, and he's working through the circumstances. It doesn't make what Jacob did right, and Jacob had lessons to learn before he would himself have a right relationship with God. And so it's a long way of saying we don't really know. There's one element to that question about the difference between the birthright and the blessing. They seem to be somewhat related, but two different things. The birthright is that first place in the family where the oldest son would, often in those cultures, would get a double inheritance. And there were in those days good reasons for that. But very often we see in scripture how God goes after the younger one or the underdog in the family. David is a case in point of someone like that. And so in the culture, there seemed to be this concept of birthright, but then in the workings of God, didn't seem to really make a difference. And then the blessing is related, but similar.
Okay, thanks, Dad. You're getting fired. Yeah, a lot of questions being fired your way, and there's a bunch more coming in. But this is going to be the final one for tonight. Then we have a couple announcements. This is from Harshit, and I believe that this is in relation to God blessing Abraham and his descendants with the land. He asks, "What is your opinion about the UN and other nations trying to change the boundaries of the land that was given to Abraham by God? Even the U.S., which has its foundation based according to the Bible, is doing this."
Well, it's very specifically the question is asking about the UN's involvement in all that. For me to answer that well, I would have to know a lot more about UN policy, UN motive, and all the rest. God's going to have his way in the end. He will use people in spite of them, like he did with Babel, or because of them, like he did with Abraham. And I think time will tell whether the UN is most helpful with regard to God's plan or not. I'm more concerned about the unfairness in the UN, about how Israel is targeted with negative resolutions far more than any other country, including some of the ones that are well documented with horrible human rights abuses, and yet Israel keeps getting targeted. But I think part of that is, whether people understand it or not, God's spotlight is on that land, and so it kind of makes people crazy, and they don't really know why they're reacting the way they are. I think the UN would be well advised to be fair with regard to Israel. And in terms of specific political decisions between now and the Lord's return, God help people to make the right decisions.
Well, thanks, Dad. And thanks for tackling questions from geopolitics to the minute wording regarding God's promises and curses and Jacob wrestling. So appreciate your honesty, vulnerability, and the time that you've poured into these sessions. Thank you, everyone who's tuning in from all around the world. We're just about to wrap up. I know that just as I'm learning so much from my dad, so also are you. And so I do want to invite you to consider. My dad is offering this course totally for free. And there's no expectation on anybody to give, but if it is on your heart to be able to help give financially to my dad, I want to encourage people to consider it. If you find value in the time and the energy my dad's putting into it, might you consider that? You're able to donate to my dad at alangilman.ca/support. That's alangilman.ca/support. And if you can consider that, that would be really appreciated. But at the same time, there's no pressure on anybody. It's very much on my dad's heart to be able to make this course available to everyone, everywhere, all around the world. Well, thanks so much for tuning in from everywhere you are. Those of you tuning in from Egypt, I believe it's now 3:30 a.m. where you are. And I hope that you will get a chance to go back to sleep and catch up on some much needed rest. I look forward to seeing you all next week. And may God richly bless you as you dive into his word, both old and new. Have a good night.